Today I'm going to show you how to make your own sourdough at home in a wood-fired oven. I'm going to take you through the process starting with a starter. So if you don't have an active starter, find another video to do that first, and then I'll take you through the whole process from feeding your starter to making a leaven, making your dough, autolyse, folding, bulk fermentation, shaping, and then baking. Let's go. Okay, first step is feeding our starter to get it nice and active to bake our bread tomorrow. To do this, I've got a starter that has been in the fridge, which means it's been sleeping and it's not active. We need to feed it to reactivate it to bake tomorrow. I'm feeding mine at a ratio of 1 to 1 to 1. This means 50 equal parts. So for me, 50 grams of starter, water, and flour. So I've taken 50 grams of starter from the fridge and added 50 grams of tepid water, which is nice room temperature water. And then I'm going to add 50 grams of flour, and I'm choosing to do 25 grams of wholemeal flour and 25 grams of baker's flour. You can do just baker's flour or just wholemeal flour. I find that my starter becomes more active off a bit of wholemeal flour. That's because there's more yeast for it to feed off. I'm just going to put those all in here and mix it slightly. You don't need to mix it a lot, and then we'll leave that for about 6 hours and feed it again in the afternoon. Some tips on keeping your starter. I find that they work best in a glass jar over plastic. Choose one with a wide mouth so it's easy to clean. The starter is extremely sticky, and a jar with a narrow mouth or opening will be fiddly. Use masking tape to write the weight of your jar. So I've put 209 here, that's the weight of this jar, so later when I feed it, I can just subtract the jar from the total of starter that's in there. I'll show you that later. And another good tip is a good set of kitchen scales. If you're buying a new one, look for a larger scale. That means we can put our big baking bowls on here and not have to crouch down to see the amount. So that's step 1. We'll be back later in the afternoon for step 2, which is feeding our starter again. Okay, so our sourdough starter, it's been about 4 to 6 hours since we first fed our sourdough starter this morning. I've had it in a warm place covered with this cloth, which allows it to absorb all the good yeast and bacteria from the air. And now we've got to do our second feed for the day. So because I'm feeding this at a 1 to 1 ratio, I need to leave 50 grams of starter in this jar and discard the rest. So, whoops. So my jar weighs 210, and I'm keeping 50 grams of starter in there, so it needs to weigh 260. It currently weighs 258. So now I've got 50 grams of starter in my jar, and this is all of the discarded starter. This can just go in the bin or feed it to your chickens, put it in your compost, or there's lots of different recipes that you can make with it, like English muffins, sourdough pancakes. You can fry this just in a fry pan with, I like fennel seeds and spring onions, and it's like a nice flatbread. Or you can give it to one of your friends so that they can start feeding it and create their own starter and bake their own sourdough bread. So now I'm adding 50 grams of water. And now I'm going to add 50 grams of flour, and I'm going to do 25 grams of just unbleached baker's flour and 25 grams of wholemeal flour, roughly. Now I just mix all of this together. It doesn't need a vigorous mix, but scrape down the starter that's gone up the sides. I have heard the less you mix it, or if you leave clumps of flour, that the starter will actually work harder to consume those. I haven't necessarily found that's true, but it might work for yours. That'll do. So now I'll just cover it back up, and we'll leave this for another 4 to 6 hours and then move on to the next step, which is creating a leaven. Okay, so now we're on to the third step. We've fed our starter once this morning, once in the afternoon, and now it's nice and active. Now it's time to make the leaven. The leaven is what we're going to use tomorrow to put into our dough. So to make the leaven, we're going to take 50 grams of starter and then add flour and water together. It's basically another form of the starter, more volume of it though. I quite like to make my leaven into one of these because the volume's slightly more, so it's going to rise a bit more. Today I'm just going to do it in a jar though. So I'm taking 50 grams of my starter and putting it into my leaven jar. You can cut all this bit out. And then I'm doing 80 grams of tepid water. And then I'm doing 75 grams of flour, roughly half baker's, half wholemeal. A good tip when you're either feeding your starter or making your leaven, I always do my starter in the jar first, and then I add the water, and then I add the flour. I find adding the water second makes it a bit easier to incorporate all of the leaven. So now we just mix this. And I'll either cover this with a cloth again. I find I can also, if I've made it in here, just put the lid on, and we're going to leave it overnight in a warm place. And then tomorrow, this leaven, 140 grams of this leaven is going to go into our dough. What we have left here is the rest of our starter that's nice and active. If you're not planning on baking again anytime soon, put the lid back on and it can go in your fridge until you're ready to take it out, feed it again, and make another leaven. Alright, I'll see you in the morning to make the dough. Okay, yesterday we did the feeding of our starter. We fed it once in the morning for step 1, second time in the afternoon, step 2, and then last night we made the leaven, step 3. Now it's the next day, the morning that we want to bake, and we're ready for our next step, which is the autolyse. The autolyse is adding water, to our flour. There's also recipes that will have a fermentolyse, which is when you add the water, flour, and your leaven. We're just doing an autolyse. The autolyse allows your gluten strands to start developing. So we're going to do an autolyse for 1 hour, and this will usually minimize how much kneading you have to do or folding you have to do, because the gluten's already spent some time developing. We're also doing it before we add the leaven and the salt, which absorbs the moisture and starts the fermentation. We don't want to start the fermentation yet. We just want to build gluten strands. So last night we weighed our flour in our bowl. I have 700 grams of flour. You can just do the 700 grams of plain bread flour, or you can have a combination of wholemeal. And now I'm just going to add 500 grams of tepid water. There we go. Now we're just going to stir this until we get a shaggy dough. We're just basically hydrating the flour. So we're just mixing until the flour is as absorbed into the water as we can, or the water is absorbed into the flour. Okay, that's about good. Now we're just going to cover this and leave it for 1 hour. You can cover it with cling wrap. You can cover it with cling wrap, but a good tip is to get shower caps, so you're not wasting a lot of plastic. There we go. We'll come back in 1 hour for the next step. It's been an hour since we started our autolyse, so now it's time for the next step, which is adding the salt and the leaven. So we're going to add 140 grams of our leaven, which, as you can see, is nice and active from last night. It's doubled in size, and it's looking very bubbly. One test to do if you're worried, if you're not sure if this is active enough, is to do a float test. And you can do this several times throughout your bread baking to make sure that you're on the right track. And this is one of them. So what we're going to do is just try and float a little bit of our leaven on top of this water. It can be a tricky thing to do, and if you handle it too much, it's not going to float. You want to just get like a tiny bit and pop it on top, and that's floating. If you use too big a piece, it's going to sink to the bottom. If you handle it too much, it's going to sink to the bottom. You've got to do it really gently. But sometimes, as you can see, it's just fallen to the bottom now. But sometimes this won't be active enough and you won't be able to get it to float. You could probably still bake with it. If that is the case, it might be that this has actually reached its peak of fermentation and it's actually starting to decline, because that's what it does. When you feed it, it'll grow up and then it will reach its peak and then it will start going down. So it might be that yours has peaked too early and is on the decline and it's not going to float. You can still bake with it. You'll get some form of bread at the end. But tests like these are good to do along the way to understand what is actually going to get a good loaf of bread for you. Okay, now that we know that this is nice and active, we're going to add 140 grams of our leaven into our flour and water. This leftover bit, again, can be discarded, or you could give it to a friend to start another starter. Last night, the leftover starter in the jar, we can now keep feeding that and keep that going as our starter. Or we could have chucked out what we did last night, and your leftover leaven actually becomes your new starter. Doesn't really matter, whatever's easiest for you. Now we add 2.5 teaspoons of salt. I'm just using crummy, cheap home brand type of salt, but you could get nice, proper kosher salt, I guess. So 2.5 teaspoons. Now we've got to make sure that this is incorporated really well. The mixing technique to incorporate it well is squelching it with your hands like this. As soon as this leaven is added, the fermentation process is going to start taking place. You want to make sure that you're getting those last bits of flour that weren't hydrated from the Autolyse, and that the salt is being worked right through the dough. You can see by squishing it like this, we're sort of cutting it. You'll actually feel it starting to change texture as soon as you add the salt and the leaven. Okay, I'm about happy with that now. So now we're just going to cover it back with our shower cap and leave it for half an hour to relax a bit, because that was a bit stressful. And then we're going to come back and do our first fold. Okay, it's been 30 minutes since we added the salt and leaven, so now it's time for the next step, which is our first fold. So don't ever work with flour on your hands. You might be tempted to do that because it's very sticky, but you don't need it. I like to put a little bit of water on the bench to stop it from sticking from the bench. So this is the first of several folds that we're going to do, and what folding is doing is replacing kneading. The reason that we're not kneading it is because, as you can see, this is a very sticky dough. It's a high hydration, which means we've got more percentage of water than you would a typical dough for like a pizza or some other breads or whatever. So instead of folding it, which is too tricky, instead of kneading it, we're going to fold it. There's several different ways to do this. One technique is leaving it in the bowl and sort of lifting up the corners and folding them over themselves. Another one is to just lightly fold it into thirds. The technique that I've found to be the best, and I'm going to show you today, is a bit more hands-on. I actually stretch the dough right out. What kneading or folding is doing is taking the web of gluten structures, which are all mixed like a spider web, and trying to align them all going in the same direction. So stretch it out. Notice what the texture is like at the moment. I'll just take a little bit here to show you. We've already formed quite a good gluten structure. What I'm doing here is what people call the window pane test, where you try and stretch out the dough enough to hold up to the light and see through. So as you can see, it started to do that, but it broke apart, which tells me that we need to develop our gluten strands more. So I stretch it out like this, and then I fold it roughly thirds, turn it, stretch it out a bit more, and then I roll it while I'm sort of pulling it, which is again stretching it, using the tension of the bench but from its stickiness. And that's it. That will go back into our bowl. That was quite a stressful process for it, so it needs to rest again and relax before we come back in 30 minutes to fold it again. Okay, we've let our dough rest for another 30 minutes, so now it's time to fold it again. So you can see it's changing quite a lot. It's relaxed in here after the last fold. It's still very sticky. Take it out and put a bit of water on the bench again. A good habit to get into while you're doing this is the window pane test. So take off a bit of dough again and see how strong it's becoming. So you can see here that's pretty good. And the reason that it's pretty good after we've only done a couple of folds is because we did that Autolyse at the beginning that was already speeding up the development of the gluten strands. But we're going to keep going. The more folding you do, the nicer the crumb will be. And the crumb is not the crumbs that are left over after you finish it. The crumb, for some reason, is the name for the texture of the inside of the bread. So if you say it has a nice crumb, you mean that it's got a good texture. You can see that it's developing some bubbles here as well. That's because the fermentation process is happening at the same time as the folding. So you'll see recipes refer to the bulk fermentation, which is the main fermentation process of the bread. Our bulk fermentation is happening simultaneously while we're doing our folding. So again, stretch it out, fold it into thirds. You can sort of feel how much the dough can take. So sometimes I'll do it into thirds and sometimes I'll do it more because it feels a lot more elastic, like it's gonna withstand a few more folds. There we go. Back into our bowl. You can put a bit of water in the bottom so it doesn't dry out. And then the shower cap back on. A good tip is to keep track of how many folds you're doing. We're aiming for 6 folds in this recipe, but it also just depends. We're going to keep doing the window pane test each time we're folding, and sometimes you'll find that maybe it'll need a 7th fold, or maybe you could stop at 5. Either way, it's a good tip to keep track of how many folds you're doing. If you're using cling wrap on the top of your bowl, get a permanent marker and mark it off each time. Because I'm using the shower cap, I just keep a piece of paper and a pen nearby and mark off each time I'm folding. It's easy to lose track. Now we'll leave this for another 30 minutes and we'll come back to do our next fold. Okay, It has now been 1 hour since we left it to finish its bulk fermentation. So we'll have a look how it's going. You can leave it for 1 to 2 hours. What you're looking for is it's relaxed again since the last fold, and it's sort of puffed up a little bit. You can see some bubbles here. You want a few bubbles. Another test we can do to see if it's at the peak or if it's finished its bulk fermentation is do another float test. So we did the float test to check if the leaven was active. We've done the window pane test to check if our gluten strands are developed, and now we can do another float test at the end of the bulk fermentation. So again, the float test can be a little bit tricky. You've got to be very gentle with the dough and not sort of handle it too much. I use some clean kitchen scissors, and you can only do a little bit, and sometimes it won't even work. See, I handled that one a bit too much. It's just floating. So it's a pretty temperamental test to do, but it's worth giving it a go. If it doesn't float and you've only left it for 1 hour, I would leave it for the second hour. If you've left it the second hour and you're also running out of time, you can still bake it. You'll get something that looks like bread, regardless of whether it passed the float test or not. But they're good tests to kind of do while you're baking to understand what your dough is doing and why you get a successful loaf or an unsuccessful loaf. Now we move into the bench rest. So we can turn out our dough. Try and be gentle with it. We don't want to knock out all the air in it. Some doughs, like a pizza dough at this stage, you take it out and pound it down, but we don't want to do that. We're going to work gently with it. On just a wet bench where you haven't floured it, we don't want our dough to have any flour on it at this stage, and we're going to cut it. This is going to make 2 small loaves. You can get your scales out and weigh it so you can get 2 perfect loaves, but I don't mind it having 2 slightly different sized ones. So I'm simply cutting it and then just arranging it into a shape like that. You can see this one's probably a bit bigger than that one. That's fine. And now we're going to cover them and leave them to bench rest for 1 hour. Cover them with a couple of bowls like that is fine. Then we'll come back and do our final shaping before we bake. Okay, it's now been 1 hour since we cut the dough and left it for its bench rest. So now we're on to one of the last steps, which is the shaping. So for the shaping, we need some baskets that prepared for it to go into. So this is an old ricotta basket from a deli. You could use a colander or you could buy a proper proving basket. And then I've got a napkin to go in here. You can just use a tea towel, will work fine. And you want to liberally flour your tea towel or napkin because the dough is still going to be quite sticky while we're putting it in to the baskets. So we're going to do what's called an envelope fold. And then we're going to shape it slightly with one of these. You don't need much flour on the bench, and you will find that it's a bit tricky to work with at first because it's still very sticky. It can sense your fear, so you've just got to act with certainty and it should be okay. So I pick it up and sort of stretch it out slightly into a rough rectangle shape. And then I'm folding up the bottom. You can use your bench scraper here to help you if it's very sticky. I'm folding each side over, and then we've got this tongue hanging out that I'm going to fold over that way. Then I'm flipping it, and now I'm going to slightly shape it using the scraper in my right hand and my left hand to sort of guide it. So I'm swiping around, creating tension and pulling it back on itself. Swiping around, creating tension, pulling back. You don't need to do this many times. You don't want to overwork it. And you will find that it gets a bit sticky to the bench, and you kind of use the stickiness, the tension that it's creating on the bench to help you pull it around. What you want to do is create tension over the top and be moving the dough around to the bottom. Now it's ready to go into our basket. We want to put it into the basket with all the seam side, which is the underneath, will be facing up. So we've kind of got to flip it. When it's at this stage, I like to just tidy up the bottom a bit to create even more tension on the top of our dough. To do that, I do what's called stitching, where I just kind of pull the dough into the center a little bit. There's lots of different techniques to do this. And the better you shape your dough, the more consistent a shape you will get when it goes into the oven. But if you don't get a consistent shape, it's still going to taste good. So you'll get better at shaping as you go. Now we fold this up. Make sure you've got lots of flour on the top so it doesn't stick. And then we need to leave this to rest for another hour before we bake. At this stage, if like me, you're about to go out and maybe you've run out of time to bake today, there is the option at this stage to put this in the fridge overnight. Putting it in the fridge will stop the proving process, so it's not going to over ferment too much, and then you could wake up early tomorrow morning and bake it. I will wait one more hour and then bake it in the wood-fired oven tonight. If you don't have a wood-fired oven, now is the time that you should turn on your oven to 200 degrees with a cast iron Dutch oven with the lid. Put this in your oven with the lid on and turn your oven up to 200 degrees. It's important when you're baking your sourdough in the oven that this is very hot when it goes in. So preheat your oven at this stage. Okay, so we're going to bake 4 loaves tonight in our wood-fired oven. We lit this at about lunchtime today, brought it up to temperature, all the wood at the back with the lid on, and then we let it come right up to temperature, which is important, and then cleared all the coals and wood out, and now we've brought it back down to temperature. We're going to bake our bread tonight at about 220 degrees, partially because I want to go out, and so we're trying to speed up the process a bit. 220 degrees in a wood-fired oven is going to give us a really nice, very dark crust. It almost looks burnt, but it tastes delicious. Moisture helps the bread rise, so we've got this really clean looking moist towel that we're going to put over the door at the front to produce a bit of steam. If you're baking this in your oven at home, this is where you'll cut out a circular piece of parchment paper and put it on a chopping board, and then you'll flip the dough onto that and put it into your Dutch oven. But I'm going to show you how to get it into the wood-fired oven. Okay, so I've said that these should rest for at least an hour or be put in the fridge. We're cheating it and we're going to see what happens. We're trying to speed up the process and we don't want to wait the full hour. So ours are definitely shy of that, but I'm pretty confident that we're going to get some form of bread because I can see that it looks nice and active. It's been through the bulk fermentation. And I let it rest a little bit since I shaped it, and that's important to let it relax down again. So now I'm going to flip it out onto my paddle here. As you can see, we put the liberal amount of flour on to stop it from sticking, which is important, but I don't like a mouthful of flour when I eat my toast. So I use a pastry brush to brush off as much sort of flour as will gently come off without me disturbing the dough too much. The next thing we have to do is score the dough. You'll see lots of different ways to do this, lots of fancy ways. You can get scissors and make amazing patterns. The most important thing is that you're giving the dough a deep incision so it will rise up nicely. I find that one straight down the middle is best, or either two around the corner. I'll do one nice deep one down the middle. Make sure you use a nice sharp razor blade so you can make deep, quick incisions. And now into the oven. There we go. And now I'll put the rest of them in and we'll let them bake for about 20 minutes before we check them. It's been 20 minutes since we first put the bread in, and I'm just going to open it to check it and move the bread that's sitting at the back of the oven to the front because the back is hotter. So they're looking good. They've risen nicely. Ooh, that one's cool. So now we'll leave them in another 20 minutes to get a nice dark top. Okay, it's been another 20 minutes and the bread's probably ready to take out now, so we're just going to check it. Ooh, yeah, it's looking good. So you can see it's got nice color on it. The test to check if it's properly cooked through is tap the bottom, and you want to get a nice sort of hollow sound. That sounds pretty good to me. We can brush off the excess flour on the bottom of these with a brush. This one's got a little bit more colour. That one's nicely shaped. Okay, so it's taken a very long time. It's taken a very long time to get to this stage, and now is the hardest part. You can't eat the bread yet. This is a really important step, and it is why it's best to bake 2 loaves at a time, because I don't have faith that you'll be able to follow this last step properly. You will cut into this loaf earlier than you should. It's really important that they cool at least for 2 hours to come right down to temperature. If you cut into them too early, the crumb will be gummy, kind of sticky. The cooking is like still happening while they're coming down to temperature, and trust me, the first one you'll cut into and you'll be pretty proud of yourself, but when you eat the second one that's come down to room temperature, that's when you know you're a true baker. And that's how you make sourdough.